I saw the email notification pop up, grade posted, English 102 midterm paper. My heart started doing this weird heavy thud against my ribs. I clicked it open, palms sweating, and the number just stared back at me from the screen. 61%. A D-. On a paper I'd legitimately lost sleep over, poured hours into, followed every stupid instruction for. And I knew instantly with chilling certainty why. This wasn't about comma splices or weak topic sentences. This was Ms. Evans, my aggressively woke English professor, making good on her silent promise. This was her revenge because I dared to push back, dared to not participate in her mandatory pronoun ritual weeks earlier. This grade was meant to punish me, to silence me, maybe even fail me. But as the initial shock turned into cold, simmering rage, I made a different promise to myself. Oh, she wanted to use her power to push her ideology and ruin my transcript? She had no idea how badly she'd miscalculated. She thought she was untouchable. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. This wasn't just going to be a complaint. This was going to be an investigation. And I was going to make sure her little power trip backfired spectacularly. Before Ms. Evans detonated my GPA, my life was, well, pretty normal. I'm Mark, just a regular junior trying to get a business degree without accumulating too much debt or drama. College for me was always a means to an end. Learn useful stuff, get the diploma, land a decent job. I wasn't there to join marches or argue about abstract theories that seemed disconnected from reality. My parents run a small hardware store back home. I grew up valuing common sense, hard work, and treating people as individuals, not just members of groups. When someone needed a specific bolt, you didn't lecture them on the systemic implications of threaded fasteners. You helped them find the right bolt. That's kind of how I approached things. Practical. Down to earth. My campus definitely had its share of the performative stuff. You know, the constant outrage, the virtue signaling contests on social media, the ever-expanding list of things you weren't supposed to say or think. Most of it just seemed like background noise, honestly. Annoying sometimes, but usually easy enough to ignore if you just focused on your own business. I had my classes, my part-time job hauling plates at a restaurant downtown, great for free food, terrible for my sleep schedule, and my roommates, a couple of equally normal guys mainly interested in sports, video games, and passing calculus. Life felt stable, predictable. Maybe a little boring sometimes, but I liked knowing what to expect. My goal was simple: keep my head down, get good grades, and avoid unnecessary conflict. English 102 was just another box to check on the required course list. How much trouble could one English class possibly be? Famous last words, right? The trouble, of course, arrived in the form of Ms. Evans. From day one, she wasn't just teaching English, she was on a mission. Every single reading, whether it was a classic poem or a modern short story, was somehow contorted to fit her rigid social justice narrative. Forget symbolism or character development. We were endlessly dissecting problematics, intersectional failures, and hegemonic narratives. She had this way of speaking with intense, unwavering conviction, like she possessed the ultimate truth and anyone who didn't immediately agree was morally suspect. She smiled constantly, this wide, bright, artificial smile, but her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the room, evaluating, judging. She talked endlessly about creating a safe and inclusive space, but the unspoken translation was clear. A space safe for my views, inclusive of those who agree with me. You could feel the pressure to conform, thick and heavy in the air. I tried to just fly under the radar, do the readings, take notes. But about 3 weeks in, she dropped the bomb. "Okay, class," she announced, clapping her hands together with that forced cheerfulness that always set my teeth on edge. "To truly embody inclusivity and respect, we're going to establish our community norms. Let's go around and share our names and our pronouns." My gut clenched. Here we go. The pronoun circle. Look, call people what they want, fine. But this public, mandated declaration felt like a loyalty oath. It felt invasive. Like demanding everyone announce their political affiliation or religious beliefs. Why was this necessary in an English class? People started murmuring their names, followed by she/her, he/him, a few they/them. Most looked vaguely uncomfortable but went along with it. Then it was my turn. I took a breath. "Hi, I'm Mark." Silence. Miss Evans tilted her head, that smile freezing slightly at the edges. "And your pronouns, Mark?" Her voice was still sweet, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. Everyone was looking at me. It felt like a spotlight. Just Mark is fine, I said, trying to sound casual. He/him is what people generally use, that works. Big mistake. The sweetness vanished. Mark, she said, her voice becoming louder, firmer, laced with disappointment. Sharing our pronouns is an active act of allyship. It helps normalize the practice and ensures everyone feels seen and validated. Choosing not to participate can inadvertently signal that you don't value that safety. My face felt hot. She was painting me as the bad guy, the potential threat, right there in front of everyone. I definitely respect how everyone identifies, I clarified, trying to keep my voice even, though annoyance was bubbling up. I just personally feel it's unnecessary to announce it. I don't think it makes the space unsafe if I don't. Her eyes narrowed. Respect isn't passive, Mark, she retorted sharply. It requires active affirmation. Your personal comfort doesn't outweigh the collective need for a validated environment. The message was crystal clear. My dissent was the problem. I was disrupting her carefully constructed safe space by simply opting out of her ritual. She stared me down for a long, uncomfortable moment before finally moving on, but the damage was done. I could feel the shift in the room. I wasn't just a student anymore, I was that guy. The one who didn't play along. The easy semester I'd hoped for evaporated in that instant. A knot of dread formed in my stomach. This woman held my grade in her hands and I had just publicly crossed her. After the pronoun incident, the chill was palpable. It wasn't like she yelled at me or anything overt, but the subtle shift was undeniable. Suddenly, my raised hand in class became invisible. If I did get called on or if I offered a comment during group discussions, Ms. Evans would give me a tight-lipped nod, maybe a non-committal and immediately pivot to someone else. Usually someone who just parroted her own point back to her using slightly different words. Those students got enthusiastic praise, "Excellent point, Jessica," or "Yes, exactly, Brian." My contributions, even when directly relevant and text-based, were met with a wall of indifference or subtle dismissal. She also ramped up the passive-aggressive comments during lectures. She'd be talking about some obscure theory and then casually drop a line like, "Of course, some individuals resist this kind of critical engagement because it challenges their ingrained privilege," while letting her gaze sweep vaguely over my section of the classroom. Or she'd say, "True intellectual curiosity requires humility, not defensive posturing," right after I tried to offer a different interpretation of a poem. It was never direct, always deniable, but the intent was clear. To marginalize me, to paint my perspective as illegitimate without ever engaging with it directly. It was psychological water torture, drip by drip. Then came the first real concrete sign, a low-stakes online quiz about identifying logical fallacies. Easy stuff, right? I knew the material, double-checked my answers. I expected close to full marks. I got a 70%. The feedback? Just one cryptic comment. Review the module on confirmation bias. What? I hadn't exhibited confirmation bias. I'd identified it in the provided examples. I looked over at Ben, the guy I'd later talked to about the big paper. He'd apparently made a comment on the discussion board earlier that week praising Ms. Evans' courageous pedagogy, or some garbage like that. He told me he got 100% on the quiz, even though he admitted he guessed on 2 questions. Coincidence? Maybe. But the knot in my stomach tightened. It felt like she was building a case, establishing a pattern of me not getting it. Around the same time, we had a peer review session for outlines of the upcoming midterm paper. We were supposed to give constructive feedback. The student reviewing my outline, someone who clearly worshipped Ms. Evans, wrote things like, "Seems like you're focusing too much on objectivity and missing the socio-political context," and "Consider centering marginalized perspectives more explicitly." This sounded suspiciously like Ms. Evans' own feedback language. When Ms. Evans collected the peer reviews, she glanced at the comments on mine and gave me this knowing little smirk. Not a friendly smile. A smirk. Like, "See? Even your peers think you're missing the point." It felt orchestrated. I was starting to feel genuinely paranoid, like I was being gaslight. Was I crazy or was this really happening? The big midterm paper wasn't just an assignment anymore. It felt like walking into a trap she'd been setting for weeks. The midterm paper. It loomed large, worth a significant chunk of our final grade. The prompt was classic Ms. Evans. Analyze a contemporary issue using a specific critical theorist whose work was dense, jargon-filled, and frankly, seemed designed to reach preordained conclusions about power and oppression. I knew I was walking a tightrope. If I just regurgitated her views, I might get a decent grade, but it felt dishonest. Academic integrity had to mean something, right? If I offered a nuanced perspective or dared to critique the theorist, I risked her wrath. I decided to take the honest route, maybe foolishly. I picked my topic, something about economic inequality, and dove into the research. I spent hours in the library, tracked down credible sources, academic studies, data sets. I read the assigned theorist carefully, trying to understand the arguments even when I disagreed with them. Then I started writing. I structured the essay logically, presented evidence clearly, cited everything meticulously using the required style guide. I acknowledged the theorist's points fairly, but I also introduced counterarguments and data that suggested a more complex picture than the theory allowed. I wasn't trying to be contrarian for the sake of it. I genuinely thought a balanced analysis was stronger. I wrote, rewrote, edited, polished. I probably spent close to 30 hours on that paper, sacrificing study time for other classes, losing sleep. I asked my roommate, who's a decent writer, to proofread it for clarity and errors. By the time I submitted it, I was exhausted, but I felt I'd produced a solid piece of academic work. Maybe, just maybe, she'd recognize the effort and the quality of the research, even if she didn't love my conclusions. The wait for the grade was agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed with an email notification, my stomach lurched. I tried to distract myself, focus on other coursework, but the thought of that paper grade hovered like a dark cloud. Then finally the email arrived. Grade posted, English 102 midterm. Paper. My hand was literally shaking as I navigated the course portal. I clicked the link, held my breath, and scanned the page. D-, 61%. Failure. It felt like a physical blow. All that work, all that effort, for nothing. My eyes scanned down to the feedback section, desperate for some logical explanation. Maybe I'd missed a crucial part of the prompt? Maybe my structure was flawed? But the comments were infuriatingly vague, purely ideological attacks disguised as academic critique. Fails to adequately center the discourse of the oppressed. What does that even mean in the context of economic data? Analysis remains trapped within problematic neoliberal frameworks. Over-reliance on empirical data without sufficient attention to lived experience narrative. And the kicker, this perspective demonstrates a fundamental lack of engagement with the core tenets of critical theory discussed in class. It was utter nonsense. There was virtually zero feedback on my actual writing, the clarity, the grammar, the organization, the use of evidence. It was all about my perspective being wrong. Her perspective, of course, being the only right one. A hot wave of fury washed over me, so intense I felt dizzy. This wasn't grading. This was punishment. This was blatant retaliation for the pronoun incident and my subsequent refusal to become one of her disciples. This grade could tank my GPA, threaten my scholarship eligibility. I couldn't let this stand. I fired off an email immediately, polite but firm, requesting a meeting to discuss the grade and understand how I could improve based on the rubric. Her reply, when it came hours later, was curt and dismissive. Mark, my office hours are clearly listed. The extensive feedback provided should clarify the grade's justification. Perhaps reflect further on the comments. Extensive feedback? It was ideological jargon. Reflect further? She meant, recant your wrong think. The condescension dripped from every word. Fine. Office hours it was. But I wasn't going there asking for mercy. I was going there to gather more ammunition. Walking towards Miss Evans' office felt like heading into enemy territory. I clutched my printed paper, red digital ink, well-highlighted comments, bleeding all over it. I took deep breaths, trying to quell the tremor in my hands and the rage simmering in my chest. Be calm, be professional, I told myself. Just ask for specifics. Her office was a shrine to her worldview, posters demanding divestment, stacks of books with titles like Deconstructing Whiteness, a faint, sickly sweet smell that might have been incense. She didn't even look up when I knocked, just gestured vaguely towards the uncomfortable-looking chair opposite her desk. Miss Evans, I started, keeping my voice level. I wanted to discuss my midterm paper grade. I spent a lot of time on it, and honestly, I'm struggling to understand the feedback in relation to the assignment rubric. Could you perhaps point to specific examples in the text where my analysis fell short or where I failed to meet the criteria? I laid the paper on her desk. She glanced at it dismissively, then leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. That condescendingly pitying look was back on her face. "Mark," she sighed as if explaining something simple to a child. "As I indicated in my comments, the issue isn't necessarily isolated sentences. It's the fundamental approach. Your paper reflects a resistance to engaging with the material on its own terms. It prioritizes a certain, outdated empirical perspective over the critical theoretical lens the assignment required. But the rubric mentioned using evidence and structuring arguments logically," I pressed, pointing to the grading sheet I'd also printed. "I cited numerous academic sources, statistical data." She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Data is not neutral, Mark. It's shaped by the very power structures we're examining. Your reliance on it, without adequately critiquing its embedded biases or centering the lived experiences that data often obscures, shows a superficial understanding. Frankly, it reads more like a defense of the status quo than a critical engagement." Lived experiences? It was a research paper on economic policy. "So," I asked, trying to pin her down, "are you saying my sources were invalid? Or my writing was unclear? Or the structure was wrong? I need concrete points I can actually work on." She huffed, clearly annoyed at being challenged. "It's about the quality of the thought, Mark. The critical consciousness demonstrated. Your paper lacked that depth. It clung to problematic assumptions." She tapped a comment on the paper, the one about problematic neoliberal frameworks. "This framework, for example, inherently centers market logic and ignores systemic exploitation. Basing your analysis on it without deconstructing it is, well, it's precisely the kind of thinking this course aims to move beyond." It was hopeless. She was dodging, weaving, using jargon as a smokescreen. She would never admit she graded me down for disagreeing with her. She had constructed this perfect, self-sealing ideological bubble where any disagreement was proof of the dissenter's ignorance or moral failing. Leaving her office, the frustration had solidified into steely determination. She thought she was untouchable behind her wall of woke buzzwords. She thought her position gave her the right to punish dissent. Game on. I wasn't just going to argue anymore. I was going to find irrefutable proof of her bias. The injustice gnawed at me. A D- wasn't just a bad grade, it felt like an accusation, a scarlet letter branding me as problematic in Ms. Evans' little kingdom. But that anger became fuel. I wasn't going to let her get away with this academic malpractice disguised as progressive pedagogy. I needed proof. Cold, hard, undeniable proof that would cut through her ideological fog. My first move was subtle. I casually struck up a conversation with Ben after our econ class. He was the one who got AC on that first paper and felt the feedback was subjective. "Hey Ben," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, still reeling from that English midterm. "Rough grade. How'd you fare?" He winced. "Tell me about it." "Scraped a C-." Honestly felt like I hit all the points she wanted, used all her favorite buzzwords, but the feedback was still vague, like, "needs more critical depth," or something. Felt like she just didn't like it. Interesting. Even playing her game didn't guarantee success if you weren't a true believer. He wasn't willing to make waves, but his experience added another piece to the puzzle. Next, I went digging online. Rate My Professor, obscure university forums, even Reddit threads about specific departments. I searched for Ms. Evans by name, looking for reviews, especially negative ones, from the last few years since her rhetoric seemed to have ramped up. Took some time, but I found them. Sprinkled among generic comments were gems like, "Warning, grades based entirely on whether you agree with her far-left politics. Feedback is useless jargon." Another, "She'll fail you if you challenge her views. Avoid at all costs if you believe in objective grading." And another, "Nice person but completely biased grader. If you're not woke enough, your GPA will suffer." I screenshot every single one, highlighting the recurring theme of ideological bias in grading. Anonymous, yes, but a clear pattern was emerging. The real goldmine, however, came from Sarah. The girl who always seemed to know the right thing to say in class and got that A- on the first paper. We were in a study group for another course, complaining about workload. On a hunch, I steered the conversation back to English. "Man, I'm still trying to figure out where I went wrong on that midterm," I said, feigning confusion. Yours was really good, right? What did Evans actually say makes for a paper in her class? Would you mind if I just glanced at yours again? I'm trying to crack the code for the final. Sarah, flattered and eager to show off her success, readily pulled up her graded paper on her laptop. Sure, no problem. Honestly, I just tried to use the theorists she liked and connect everything back to power structures. As I scrolled through her paper, my jaw tightened. Her writing was okay, definitely not stellar. There were awkward sentences, a few clear grammatical errors, and some arguments felt thin, mostly just rephrasing lecture notes. But the feedback from Ms. Evans? Glowing. Excellent synthesis. Insightful connection. Exactly the kind of critical thinking we need. Then I saw it, a paragraph discussing the same concept I'd covered, using similar evidence, but reaching the conclusion Ms. Evans favored. My paragraph had been shredded with comments about being simplistic and ignoring nuance. Hers, marked with profound understanding. Even more damning, I spotted two specific grammatical errors, a run-on sentence and a subject-verb agreement issue, that were identical to errors Ms. Evans had harshly penalized me for. On Sarah's paper? Completely ignored. No comment. No deduction. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the smoking gun. The blatant discrepancy, side by side, was undeniable proof. She wasn't applying the same standards. She was grading based on allegiance. I had to get a copy. Wow, this is actually super helpful for seeing the structure, I said, trying to sound appreciative. Any chance you could email it to me? Just so I can refer back to it when I'm outlining the final paper? Sarah, beaming from the praise, readily agreed. Sure thing, she said, typing out an email. The moment that file landed in my inbox, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had her. Ms. Evans' bias wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was documented fact. Now I had the ammunition. It was time to load the weapon and aim it carefully. I spent the next evening compiling everything into a digital dossier that would be impossible to ignore. It included 1. My D- paper, complete with Ms. Evans' vague, politically charged feedback highlighted. 2. Sarah's A- paper, which I anonymized as Paper B, same assignment. With annotations clearly showing the much lower standards applied, the ignored errors, and the glowing praise for ideologically aligned yet arguably weaker content. I created side-by-side comparison tables for specific sections showing the disparate grading. 3. The screenshots of the online professor reviews explicitly mentioning grading bias and ideological favoritism. 4. A detailed, factual summary of my office hours meeting with Ms. Evans, quoting her evasive and jargon-filled responses and her refusal to provide specific actionable academic feedback based on the rubric. 5. A formal cover letter addressed to Dr. Ramirez, the head of the English department. In it, I calmly and professionally stated my concern regarding potential grading bias in English 102, citing specific evidence of inconsistent standards that appeared linked to students' perceived agreement with the instructor's personal viewpoints, potentially violating university policies on fair and objective evaluation. I reread everything multiple times, ensuring it was precise, evidence-based, and devoid of emotional ranting. The facts needed to speak for themselves. My hands were surprisingly steady as I attached the meticulously organized PDF to the email addressed to Dr. Ramirez. The subject line was simple: Formal grade concern English 102 mark, my last name. I hovered over the send button for a second, took a deep breath and clicked. There was no turning back now. The response from Dr. Ramirez came faster than I expected, within 24 hours. Her email was brief, professional, and serious. She acknowledged receipt of my concerns and the supporting documentation, and requested a meeting in her office later that week. No hint of dismissal, no attempt to brush it off. Just a straightforward request to discuss it further. That alone felt like a small victory. Walking into Dr. Ramirez's office felt completely different from entering Ms. Evans' activist den. Dr. Ramirez's space was organized, professional, lined with bookshelves containing actual literature, not just political tracts. She greeted me formally but politely, offered me a seat, and had my dossier printed out on her desk. "Mark," she began, her expression serious but unreadable. "Thank you for coming in. I've reviewed the materials you sent. Please walk me through your primary concerns." My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm and stick to the facts. I laid out the timeline: the pronoun incident, the subtle shift in treatment, the quiz grade, the peer review comments, and finally, the midterm paper. I didn't accuse Ms. Evans of malicious intent directly. I focused relentlessly on the evidence of inconsistent grading. I walked Dr. Ramirez through the side-by-side comparisons of my paper and Paper B, pointing out identical errors receiving vastly different marks, similar arguments receiving opposite feedback based on their conclusions, and the vague, non-actionable nature of the criticism I received versus the effusive praise given for ideological alignment. I showed her the online reviews, noting the recurring pattern. I recounted the office hours meeting, emphasizing the refusal to connect feedback to specific rubric criteria. Dr. Ramirez listened intently, nodding occasionally, her eyes scrutinizing the documents as I spoke. She asked sharp, clarifying questions. Was this the standard rubric for all students? Yes. Were there other assignments showing similar discrepancies? I mentioned the quiz. Did Ms. Evans provide explicit examples of centering marginalized voices that you failed to meet? No, it was always abstract. The tension in the room was thick. She spent several minutes silently comparing the feedback on the two papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she looked up, her expression grave. "Mark, thank you for bringing this forward in such a thorough and professional manner," she said, her voice low and serious. "The evidence you've presented raises significant concerns regarding the application of consistent and objective grading standards in this instance. As you know, university policy mandates fair evaluation based on demonstrated mastery of course material and stated criteria, irrespective of a student's personal viewpoints." She paused, meeting my eyes. "I want to assure you that this will be taken very seriously. I will be initiating a formal review of Ms. Evans' grading practices for this course." Formal review. Investigation. The words were music to my ears. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. The system was actually working. "This process is confidential," Dr. Ramirez continued, "but it will involve examining grading patterns across the section to ensure fairness and adherence to departmental standards. We need to ensure all students are assessed equitably." Leaving her office, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with fierce satisfaction. I had done it. I had stood up to the bias, presented the evidence, and the person in authority had listened and acted. The immediate impact wasn't visible to everyone, but I knew the wheels were turning. In the remaining English classes, Ms. Evans seemed diminished. The aggressive certainty was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. She avoided my gaze entirely. Then came the moment. Dr. Ramirez appearing briefly at the classroom door during one of Ms. Evans' lectures, motioning her outside. Ms. Evans' face went ashen. She stammered an excuse about needing to step out and practically fled the room. She returned minutes later, visibly shaken, her composure completely gone. Seeing that raw panic replaced the usual smug superiority, that was the real climax. She knew she'd been caught. Her untouchable facade had crumbled. The official resolution came quietly as expected. A few weeks after the semester ended, I received a formal email from Dr. Ramirez. It stated that following a review, my midterm paper grade had been reassessed by another member of the English faculty. My grade was adjusted from a D- to a B+. The email concluded by stating that appropriate measures have been implemented to ensure consistent adherence to university grading policies in future offerings of the course. No explicit details about Ms. Evans' fate, but the message was clear. Consequences had been delivered. Later, I heard whispers through departmental gossip: mandatory retraining on assessment standards for Ms. Evans, closer supervision of her courses by Dr. Ramirez, speculation that her teaching contract might be reviewed more critically when it came up for renewal. Whether she was fired or just severely reprimanded, I never knew for sure. But her ability to unilaterally impose her ideology through punitive grading had been definitively curtailed. Getting that grade change felt fantastic, obviously. It rescued my GPA from the crater she tried to dig for it. But the real victory was deeper than that. It was the validation of standing up for what was right, even when it felt intimidating. It was proof that pushing back against ideological overreach, armed with facts and determination, could actually work. The whole ordeal was incredibly stressful, time-consuming, and frankly infuriating. It shouldn't be necessary for students to mount a full investigation just to get a fair grade. But navigating it and ultimately succeeding, gave me a profound sense of satisfaction. My college life went back to normal, focusing on business, surviving economics, hanging out with friends. But the experience left its mark. It reinforced my belief in common sense, objective standards, and the importance of challenging those who abuse positions of power, no matter how progressive their justifications sound. Miss Evans thought she could shame me, fail me, and get away with it because her cause was righteous. She learned that fairness still matters. And watching her ideological certainty crumble under the weight of her own exposed bias, that was a lesson I and hopefully she won't soon forget. Justice served cold and documented.